apart from having Professor Fischlo here, which is one of the reasons why we are all here to discuss, it is the topic, right? So Lula is back. You can see there's some people here. So Lula is back, and for many people, this represents a turning point in Brazil's history. And the great question is, to which direction? There's a lot of uncertainty about the future, even though for a lot of people, there's room for optimism. One of the things that we want to do here is get a multidimensional perspective about what awaits us in the next few months and beyond. So that's why we assembled a very distinctive panel that in many ways probably we wouldn't find elsewhere. And it's a privilege for us because all of them in many ways are also affiliated with Columbia or based in New York, and they have this global perspective to share. Let me introduce our speakers tonight. And it's a great pleasure to have with us Professor Emeritus Albert Fischlo back in the classroom. Professor Fischlo was the founder of this class a while ago, and we're very fortunate to have him with us tonight. We also have Professor Rodrigo Soares, a Lemon professor here at CIFA, and Professor Rodrigo has been teaching here for what, Rodrigo? 6 years, right? And we also have Philip Seligman, who is replacing Lucas Schacker, was expected to be here. Unfortunately, he had some health issues, but we're very lucky to have Felipe. Felipe is the co-founder and co-CEO of Jota, a well-known news portal in Brazil. And Jota was awarded the world's best digital media startup in 2019. And last but not least, we're very pleased to have Samar Maslad and Maziad, Vice President and Senior Analyst at Moody's Sovereign Risk Group. As you can see, we have all these different backgrounds covering markets, covering media and politics, covering policy and Brazilian history more broadly. So without further ado, let's get started. And my first question for our panelists here, and the way that we're going to proceed is first, I'm going to be asking one question to each one of our speakers. Then I'm going to be asking an open question to our panel. And then we're going to open up for Q&A. The Q&A part, the first and second part are going to be public. The third one, Q&A, we are going to stop live streaming so that we can have a more open conversation. Just reminding everyone that for the open conversation, we are operating under Chatham House rules, meaning that you are free to disseminate the content of discussion as long as you don't cite the source. And we're going to prioritize, as always, questions from the student. So student, please, you read the background readings, and please make sure that you can prepare some good questions for our discussion. So why don't we get started with the markets more immediately? I think there was a lot of excitement at the world stage, and we have the COP27 taking place. President-elect Lula, one of the superstars there. But more broadly, what can we expect? How much is the reaction, and what can we expect with the new administration?
Okay, thank you I didn't expect you to start with the market, but that's good. We can get straight to the point. I want to thank you for inviting me because it's really nice to be here. As I was mentioning earlier, it reminds me of my graduate school years, which I was shocked really to realize it was 16 years ago. Like really shocked. And that's when I finished, not when I started. So yeah, it's really nice. Thank you. Okay, I think I don't know, it depends which markets you're talking about, because there is sometimes disconnect between the Faria Lima crowd, as I call them, and our other investors or market participants here in New York. So I don't quite understand the optimism that is now seems to be, there seems to be a lot more optimism. And I have not seen I was in Sao Paulo last week, and there seems to be, I think, I would say cautious optimism. Like we're talking about the economy, and the biggest concern for Brazil, if you have thought about the economic aspects of it, is on the fiscal side. So and also on the growth front, or even though this year growth is a lot more positive or has surprised a lot to the positive side. But the biggest question or the biggest worry from the market perspective, from a rating credit perspective, is on the fiscal side. And my initial view was that there will be little that will change in that area, especially on the fiscal and macro front, because you have the spending ceiling and it's a constitutional amendment, and it's very difficult to, it's possible, obviously, the previous governments have made changes to it, but it really constrains fiscal policy. But I think with the announcement of this week that right off the bat, the proposal is to exempt relatively important spending on Bolsa Familia from the ceiling, and there's more to come. I'm a bit more worried about that area than I was kind of on the day the election results was on, what was it, the 30th, October 30th. So I think the signs there are a little bit less, a bit more concerning, I would say. On the other hand, that we do expect more changes maybe on the sectoral policy. Is the Petrobras, public banks are likely to play more of an active role, if you will, not to the extent or the magnitude that we have seen, say, in a previous Lula government or under Dilma administration, but I think there will be more interest in an interventionist kind of policy, or an more public intervention by the state in many areas. So I'll stop here and happy to take questions.
We get so quickly
Yeah.
to kick off the discussion.
Yeah.
Moving from markets and external perceptions to politics. And one of the things that probably drew most people's attention was how thin the margin, the victory, margin of victory was, and one of the outcomes of the election is probably like increased polarization. So, Felipe, to what extent like this polarization is expected to shape Lula's new administration?
Perfect. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm here. I know that a lot of people here probably came to see also Guga, and he's not here. The second time he said, "Oh, I won't be able to go there. Please go in my place." I always do it. I think the polarization is here to stay. I think this is a fact, and not only in Brazil. This is something that we can see in a lot of countries, like the US, like other countries in Europe, and so on. But I think that in that term, it's a good news for Brazil that Lula won, just because the big coalition was formed in his side and not against him in that term, politically speaking. So there is a social polarization, but somehow there's a sentence that we like to say in Brasilia, ironically, that the institutions are working there. Mm-hmm. So the Centrão is arranging, the political forces are arranging somehow, and we can see that even though you have some kind of crisis, that the party of Bolsonaro saying that he asked for the annulation of the court, there was not a reaction from the military. They are quiet, even though there are people in front of the institution asking for a military coup. They are not willing to do anything. That's at least the news there. I think that the main challenge is how Lula can build a coalition, how Lula can build a political priority for his government, taking into account two main variables. One is doing what he needs to do to deliver good results in terms of making the Brazilian inequality less abnormal, and also somehow being able to do these social changes with fiscal responsibility. And the other thing is doing all of that, not losing his popularity. That now is different than than when he left the power. When he left the power, he had more than 80% of approval rate, and now he has at least half of the country that doesn't like him at all and is willing to vote to whoever is there against Lula. They really hate Lula, and this is somehow a part of their polarization. And the problem, also the other problem, is that the Congress, who is the one that needs to change the constitution to do whatever he wants, and we are talking here he needs the support of 2/3 of the parliament to being able to do the main changes. I would say that the profile of the Congress is center right to right, and it's more right this time as it was never before. And so he will need to build a coalition to face this reality and to put his government more in the center than probably he wanted, or maybe his party wanted, PT. That's why he joined forces with the old PSDB when he invited Alckmin to be his vice president. He showed the society that he was building a coalition of different point of view to beat Bolsonaro. But the problem is the only thing that unites them clearly and a priori from the beginning is the opposition of Bolsonaro. The main ideas don't unite them, and it will be really difficult and it will be really challenging to build common ideas to present to the parliament, to convince the parliaments without having what we would say like the reaction from inside. So that's, I would say, that is a main threat. And I would say the hard time that he will face, and then I will end my first speak, is that he needs to accommodate a lot of different people. So by now in the transition team, they have already 289 people working in order to get some common idea to present to the first year of his government. So 289 people. And if you analyze it like closely and you go to the team, the economical team, you have people like Percio Arida, or like a liberal, and Nelson Barbosa, which is more like an heterodox. So I see that they will face hard time to find common ground, and that's why I think that politically it will be interesting to follow the first months.
Brilliant. No, thanks so much. And that's a good segue for Rodrigo, because we talked about politics, and now we have to talk about policy as well. And that's what's possible, and that's what we ambition to do. So, Rodrigo, first, like, what would you like to see happening in this Lula administration, and what do you think it's going to be possible for this administration to execute?
Thank you, Sidney. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here with the other panelists, but mainly above all with Professor Fischl. So actually, most of what I thought about saying, they actually said. I'm going to recollect.
Is this spec going to be approved, or is it going to be shut down? That's the question I want. The one from yesterday.
It will be
On Friday.
Okay. Oh, that's a difficult guess. But I mean, I think I can kind of bring. I agree with everything that was said before, like bringing two dimensions together. I think in terms of what it means in terms of policy, right? So trying to bring those two things together. So I think there is like, in some sense, there was, after the election, there was this talk of having a government that wouldn't be a PT government, that would have broad support, that would be representative of the different forces that went for Lula in the second term. I think to some extent, what we've seen in the transition, in that sense, has been a little disappointing. I think it's much less of that than I think I expected and most people expected. So I think it looks much more like PT, with some concessions in certain areas that were kind of expected. I think everybody expected to see Marina there. Everybody expected to see Simone Tebet there. Then actually really being a broader spectrum. And I think this is very worrisome for several reasons, partly related to the market and partly related to Congress, right? So related to the market, what we've seen over the last few days in terms of the proposals of getting the now born again Bolsa Familia out of the ceiling. It's extremely worrisome, not only by itself, but I think what it means in terms of signaling, right? Because I think people have been talking about the fiscal bomb that is set up to explode over the next few years, right? And I mean, instead of actually showing that in terms of signaling, right? Instead of actually showing that you're aware of it and that you're concerned about it, you're actually throwing gasoline on the fire, right? So I think that's very worrisome, but not only from the economic perspective. I think also in terms of relationship with Congress, it is a very right-wing Congress. So as I think Brazil never had before, So I think it's going to be very difficult to get things through. To some extent, I think depending on how the wind blows, we know how the the center can go whatever, right? They feel the wind is blowing. So I think if the opportunity to actually create some chaos appears, part of the Congress is going to be willing to do that, right? To kill Lula politically, and depending on how things go, eventually to try to accelerate an impeachment or something. So they obviously are going to be looking at the first opportunity to do that. So for me, it's a little puzzling how this transition team has come about in that sense, because it seems like almost that, I don't know if, I mean, some people say that Lula is just trying to do that to please part of the base. And actually, when it gets to the point of appointing ministers, it's going to be different. But it does sound a little confusing to me, because it seems like both from an economic and political perspective, the limits that are being imposed to policy, they don't seem to be very clear to the transition government, or to the transition team, I guess. Right. So I think it's in that sense, I think it's very worrisome. I think there are some areas of policy where it's easy to change, given how disastrous it has been over the last 2 years. So environmental policy obviously is going to improve, but it doesn't take much of an effort to do that, and it's relatively easy. There are instruments on the table that Brazil used to use that were very effective, that were just dismantled. We can go back to that and try to recover a little bit of that. We don't know if it's going to be enough, because there are new challenges related to international drug trafficking in the Amazon, related to how illegal mining, for instance, became a political movement that it wasn't before. So there are several challenges there, but I think it's easy to improve on that dimension. I think in terms of educational policy, also it's easy to improve. So there are certain areas that I think all of us kind of take as granted that some progress is going to be made, because it was really completely disastrous over the last 4 years. So I'm really talking mostly about the margins that are really the more pressing margins. And in those, I think the last couple of weeks have been quite worrisome, I think. And I don't know, I hope that I'm actually mistaken, and that when we get to see the actual cabinet being appointed, it's going to be a little different. Let's stop here.
Rodrigo, thanks, Rodrigo. And we saved the best for the last. Professor Fischler, do you agree that this is a truly historical moment for Brazil? And we'd love to hear your views of, should we be optimistic or less, so as Rodrigo was sharing them with us?
Well, I first went to Brazil 60 years ago. And it was a very different country at that time. Relatively few people spoke English. The nature of the government was about to change, as it subsequently did. The problems of Brazil now are extraordinarily different. In those days, in order to get foreign exchange, you had to know someone and talk to them and then be able to get it. Nowadays, what you do is you go to the internet and you type in a particular password, and lo and behold, you've got a loan of infinite value. It's a very different world that one has. At that time, one never knew what the rate of change of income was between 1 year and the next. today, the question is, what is the decision of the market in terms of expectations about what's going to happen overnight? So we're in a very different world than we were in then. That's a point which I think is important. The second thing that I would say is nobody in Brazil is happy now. Nobody is happy now because Bolsonaro had managed to get a government which was composed of virtually the military. If you look at the number of people that were in the government who had derived from the military, you're talking about a substantial part of the military. And although the military didn't intervene as Bolsonaro was hoping they would intervene in his favor, they sent various messages about the need to have a check done on the, and everyone was amazed that Bolsonaro actually accepted the results. And of course, why did he accept the results? He accepted the results because by that time, the large center group that has been in power managed to say, this guy was really elected. And Bolsonaro originally couldn't be found in order to come and make a concession speech because he wasn't prepared to make a concession speech. He should have talked to Trump a little longer in order to figure out what kind of process he was interested in. So you wind up then with the Central is willing to cancel the arrangement that first came in after Dilma had been impeached. And you had a whole new mechanism for determining how you were going to reduce the government expenditures. Because in Brazil, what created the Real Plan and made it work was the secret that the government wasn't going to cheat and be in a position where Cardoso was going to concede everything to individual sectors and grant subsidies and the like. What I'm worried about is that Morales is going to be a minister, but not a minister of finance. And Morales supports the notion of the plan, which he was the author of limiting the government expenditures as a way of reducing the level of debt that Brazil was confronting. Now, the debt can go anywhere. And at the current levels, as you all are aware, Brazil is no longer held as a country that can receive money from US firms that have the money of clients that will be invested in Brazil. There has to be private premiums that add to the cost. What happens now is that the government has managed to collect more money finally in this year and is rapidly of the impression, and this was the whole policy that was being followed, to enable privatization as a mechanism for reducing the debt. That's one of the things that happened under Cardoso. With this situation where Lula is insisting on 4 years before having to contend with any limitation on the debt. So he is able to allocate resources, as he says he wants to Bolsa Familia and to pay for the 400 additional reais that was approved by Bolsonaro beforehand. The other part of the story is that Lula really wasn't very good about the way he dealt with the environment. Lula was good in that he had accepted the policy plan of others who have now come out in his support, but the only way that Brazil winds up with a fiscal surplus on an annual basis is if it increases the participation of government, importantly in the Brazilian economy so that the size has to expand.
Professor, I think this is a great point for the whole panel. I think we can open up discussion for all the speakers here. One of the biggest challenges for Brazil is to think about the future, taking into consideration that we just came out of a last decade. Right? Economic growth has been dismal, and one of the biggest challenges that we can foresee in the near future is how Brazil can recover its ability to grow. Right? So for the panel here, what's your take on like what this administration can do and what can we expect to see in the next few years? Yes, please.
Let me start. I think, because I have my own theory about growth. I think after the Lava Jato, you will see again, looking at market forecasts or whatever, analysts, right? We're forecasting growth at 2.5%. This is the number that people have in mind in 2015 and in 2016 and in 2017 and in 2018. It was never that. Okay, it was barely 0 point something, maybe finally came to 1 and 1.2 in 2019. And the reason is I think everyone underestimated really the damage to the corporate sector in the aftermath of the Lava Jato. I mean, by some estimates, 30% of Brazil's corporates were essentially out of job, out of work, because the construction sector has a very big feed downstream and a lot of smaller manufacturers and all of that. So that's a big shock that I think the magnitude of it was underestimated. And now you see everybody forecasting 0% growth next year, which I don't see how, and the following year again, because we have not yet realized that the recovery that we're seeing is not just because of the, there was a big recovery, like 4-5% after COVID. That's obviously just a base effect. But there's also, I think, has been some repair that we will see now having growth a little bit like this year and last year continues to surprise upwards when everybody was forecasting 0.5, 1%, and now you see it up to 2.8, some estimates. So I find that to be like just the other side of the pendulum. So you will see, I think, better growth, I think, because of this repair process that takes a long time. That's separate from the COVID shock and now the recovery from the COVID and all of that. Now we have on top of that the shock of inflation, that the monetary policy is also dampening growth next year. So there are many things going on. But if you ask about what this government can do, I think the previous government, with all their issues, they did important reforms on the if you will, micro reforms to improve business environment, to encourage digitalization of the government. A lot of these relatively, it's not small things, but they don't grab the headlines, are really what matters for growth in a sustainable way. And you were starting to see private investment really picking up for the first time last year. I'm saying all of this because if you start thinking that the next government, now their impulse is we need more investment by Petrobras, which was happening before. We need to boost more credit through public banks and bigger role for the state. I don't think this is the path for sustainable growth, because the fiscal time bomb, as you put it, has very little room for government to be the impetus, and that is not the sustainable way to get to 2 or 3% year after year.
Perfect. And by the way, talking about reform, right? So
Yeah.
I think there's a certain consensus that the country needs to conduct reforms in order to recover its ability to grow. So what are the low-hanging fruits that Lula could take advantage of in order to create momentum for better economic outcome?
I think that the definition of low-hanging fruits can be tricky, right? But I think, economically, I think there are several low-hanging fruits. But they are not low-hanging fruits, right? So, but I think there's very little question that actually there are the misallocation of resources from the public sector is gigantic, and that actually could make a much better use of the budget as it is, right? So payroll exemptions, sector-specific incentives that PT historically had his fair share of blame for it, but Bolsonaro also kept those going and actually also enhanced some of those. I don't think there is anybody that they're going to tell you that those actually make sense. And some of them that have been there for decades, right? That some of them have been there when Dilma implemented them during the crisis, and everybody said, "Oh, they're going to be there forever," and they are here until now, and they always will be, right? Some of them are since the beginning of the automobile sector industry in the country. So this, I mean, I think there are things that could be done to increase efficiency, reduce misallocation, increase the fiscal capacity. As it is with the current, we have actually a very, very quite high, exactly, as collection even the level of developed country, of Northern European developed countries, right? As a share of GDP.
Yeah.
And but there is so much of it that is being just displaced, and I mean the misallocation is so huge that I think that's the tricky part. I mean, there are low-hanging fruits economically, but nobody wants to touch that. And this has not been actually mentioned at any point. If anything, actually, though, I mean, not explicitly, but obviously, all the speech about the regaining the role of the protagonism of BNDES and so on sounds like all of that again, right? I mean, it does bring the same bell, right?
But like the biggest improvement that happened in Brazil's macro fiscal picture was the reducing the role of BNDES and removing subsidized lending. I mean, we don't expect this will come back, but if you go back in this direction, it's just, you know, it's not only misallocation of resources, but the fiscal cost and the benefit of it are very good.
And all of it, I mean, it brings back all of the same logic, right?
Yes.
Of like choosing sectors and exempting sectors for whatever reason, and then I mean having subsidized interest rates. So I think it's a tricky question in that sense. I think there are low-hanging fruits, but maybe they are not really low-hanging in that sense, right? So.
In that point, I would say that everybody says that the lowest hanging fruit is that a tax reform, but because of those sectors that are benefited by those incentives, it's impossible to do one tax reform without making half of the country really pissed off the changing they are trying to do. So it makes it really difficult. But I think that they will try. Usually in Brazil, if you need to do a big reform, you do it in the first year. That means you still have the political power to do that. I think that there are some signals that worries the market and other people about the government, but I think it's clear by now is that Lula didn't give any information of what he thinks that should be done next year, and that's what worries everybody. So it's not possible to say by now that he will be irresponsible fiscally. But it's possible to say that he didn't say anything about that by now. And everybody wants some signal that he wants to be different than Dilma, for instance, in terms of fiscal responsibility. So in that point, I would say that he needs to communicate, and he will. It's interesting. I was back to 2002 to try to understand how the market was behaving after he was elected, and everybody by November, after he won the second round, the runoff, said, "Oh, we are worried. We don't know exactly what Lula will say and all, because he doesn't announces his economic team and all." And he eventually announced, it was in December 10 in DC, and it was not on purpose. So he was talking with the press, and he said, "Oh, the Brazilian economy is in bad health, and that's why I pick a doctor to fix it." And it was Antonio Palocci, and everybody said, "Oh, finally he finally something about that."
But there was the letter.
There was the letter. Yeah.
The letter was much before that.
There was the letter.
Yes,
Exactly.
that was a very strong
But now,
statement,
yeah,
right?
but now he keeps saying, "Oh, I already did," and it was interesting because in November 14, 2002, Lula was, I think, here, and Alckmin, that was the governor of São Paulo, and his adversary, he was in Portugal, and someone came to Alckmin and asked, "What do you think about Lula's government?" I said, "I'm sure he'll be responsible." And now again, who is saying that Lula will be responsible is Alckmin, but now not his adversary anymore. Now he's his ally. So it's funny to see this kind of relationship between there and that.
But there is an issue about being responsible. 2002, and I mean, the first term is not now. There's no spending ceiling now, and and the idea to be responsible now, it's possible to keep the deficits at current levels, but that is not responsible
Yeah.
enough.
But the problem is that if you analyze what has been done the past few years, the ceiling is it's not a reality anymore because they keep changing and giving waivers. So even in the year of election, something that never happened
Right.
before, Bolsonaro did this year, changing the constitution to approve the 100 billion check to try to be reelected. So this is something that, so everybody agrees somehow that the ceiling is not working anymore because part of the budget is now under Congress control. It's not more under, so they need to change something there. And even if Bolsonaro have won, he would be having the same discussion right now. We need a waiver constitutional amendment in order to.
I think Professor Fischler, if you want to comment.
What I would say is Brazil needs an investment intensive period of time. That only that way will you get to a situation where you don't have 14–15% going in investment, and then the government steps in and has to give subsidies because people are in trouble, etc. So I believe that you really have to do something about increasing investment. And to increase investment means no subsidies for particular projects that people dream up and want to have funded. BNDES has managed to become irrelevant from the standpoint of being able to finance anything. It always has a different rate from what the rate supposedly is. And I would say that in order to be able to have government play some role still in this process, you ought to have a higher tax on high incomes. This is the one thing that always in Brazil is refused. Everyone wants to find a way different, and you can't do it. You can't finance the increase required in investment unless you get the savings domestically. And to get the savings domestically, you've got to tax the wealthy rather than the poor.
Professor, thanks so much for bringing a very important topic here, because that sets the stage for a very, perhaps the most debated issue these days. The panel was discussing the historical perspective when Lula was elected in 2002, and first Lula administration was known for being very for having adopted a pro-market stance. And the second Lula administration was more interventionist, like it was advocating for national champions. And the big question now is to what extent we're going to see more of Lula 1 or Lula 2. So let's open the panel and to see what do you think is going to happen.
Lula one or Lula two, I can talk about that. I can react to it.
From what we've been hearing, it's more Lula 2 than Lula 1.
The last couple of weeks.
But it's not Dilma. Dilma is
Yeah.
even more than the national champions. I think it gets really,
Yeah,
and I think he intervened more to also to the economy, to the
because of the
financial
global
crisis. So it was some things that he needed to be to do at that time. I think so. I would say that somehow he'll try to. The problem of he'll try to bring more investments and to invest more and use the state to invest in Brazil and so on. So I think he will try to do that. But the problem is that everybody gets worried is what is the concept of investment for Lula and his team? What when he says what is investment? Because you need to put some money in some place and then you need to see like the growth or you need to see something. And usually Brazil spends really bad. If you take the productivity levels, we invest, we put a lot of money and they don't change. Every country is changing. Brazil doesn't change the level of
productivity has
productivity.
not increased
It's
in the last
flat.
30 years.
Education, we spend a lot, we have big programs and good programs, but the level of quality of education is not good. So saying that he will like focus on investments into he needs to understand what kind of investment, what's the quality of the public policy we're talking about. Maybe you can help us to
No, I mean,
identify.
just the thing of the Lula 1 or 2, I think goes back to the question of how much can we read from the transition team? And I think there are different interpretations. Some people are saying, oh my goodness, that's what's gonna be. Get ready, brace for it, right? So some other people say, no. Lula is very politically savvy. He's actually playing this card now so that he can please part of the base, and then he can do what he thinks he has to do later on. I think the second alternative, I think it's a bit convoluted because I mean the election is done, right? So you should be really already giving your real true signals to the market, right? Things are already happening, right? I mean the exchange rate is changing, I mean these investments coming in and out. So I think I think it's going to be closer to Lula too, honestly. I don't think I think we should read something from the transition team. I mean that's the signal that they're giving. I think we should read something into it. For me, it's disappointing in that sense, and I think it is closer to Lula too. And I think this brings all of the considerations about not national champions to the extent of the Dilma government, but a little bit of national champions, right? I think some of the big actually fusions in the big Brazilian companies are already in the second Lula, if I'm not mistaken, right? Going against CADE recommendations even and so on and so forth. So it looks a little bit like that, right? I think, but the market is going to impose some discipline. So difficult to tell, I don't know.
So I think before the elections or on the eve of the election, the expectation was that Lula won because of many reasons. The Congress, composition, it's more right-leaning, you cannot really do too much and all of that. But I think the last couple of weeks, and I think the silence, the not giving is not helpful, but it's starting to look like 1.5. I don't think it's 2, again, because there are many limitations. But I think the capacity, the ability to actually execute on a lot of things is very limited. I mean, the polarization makes it very difficult. I know you can work with Congress, and Centrão is always, willing to cooperate on certain things. So it's not like a closed door or strict opposition. There's always deals to be made. But again, given just the structure, is going to be a much more constrained. And I think the difference now is that the popularity aspect and the political power that Congress now has is a lot bigger than a president's position when it was in 2002. So that all constrains things. But I think the issue with the spending ceiling that we focus on is, despite the exemptions, it did work. You can poke holes if it did work, because after 2002, that 8% of GDP and war budget, the next year that all went away. because the ceiling was there despite relatively small exemptions. You had the debt coming down, I mean, the first fiscal surplus.
There was the pension reform too.
There was the pension
Yeah.
reform that
Yeah.
precedes all of that. That's key. Without the pension reform, the ceiling would not work. I mean, I think so
Exactly.
we're very focused on the pension reform early on. So it did work in that sense. It's just very strict. Introducing some adjustments or changes in a way is not the problem. It's what adjustments and what changes. The issue about exempting a whole line item above the ceiling means that this can grow without a constraint. I mean, this year's, I mean, you can keep growing it without any limit, and you don't have to go to Congress for an exemption anymore. So it's a lot more structurally, if you will, damaging to the ceiling than having, oh, I need 0.5% of GDP because of the crisis, because of inflation, or because of this. It changes a lot the dynamic.
But what they are discussing right now is basically there's a two point of views, right? One is let's approve a waiver for the next year
Mhm.
because we need to keep paying
Keep the
Bolsa
600,
Família,
that's fine.
keep
yeah.
the 600,
Yeah.
and then we discuss a new fiscal anchor or something
Yeah.
like that because we need to change it.
That was
There's
the
a-
baseline.
That's
Yeah.
and that's the like Pacheco, the president of Senado,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
defends a permanent waiver. So
Exactly.
taking the Bolsa Família out of the ceiling permanently for the next 4 years.
Yeah.
And I think that's not well received for everybody that understands that. And I still think that they won't do that because there's no climate to that. And even the incentives, the Central wants to have the power to approve every year, something like that. So I think the incentives are more aligned with like keeping some kind of control,
Mhm.
some kind of like power in their hands, and not giving all the power to Lula's hand before he even starts his term. I think
Yes.
that's the main discussion by now.
All right, and let's wrap up this part of this conversation with something less controversial, which is
World Cup.
We'll talk about Neymar, maybe.
Absolutely, and which is Lula's role in the world stage. Right? So I think overseas, the perception or the views about Lula are much less polarizing than
Yeah.
domestically. And then, as we know, like at the COP27, like he's one of the superstars over there. To what extent that helps Brazil? Like, can he effectively leverage this aura factor into in a way that will benefit his administration in the country?
I mean, I don't know. Then we get into diplomacy issues, right? And I'm really not sure. I mean, I wouldn't put my money on it from that, right? So if other things are not working, but I don't think I'm not sure I have much to say about it in terms of the specifics of diplomatic negotiations, right?
I would say this, perceptions matter a lot. And I think the style of former President Bolsonaro and what he says about the Amazon, and even if it's not true or untrue, that's not the point. But the perception about it actually made a lot of the reforms and the important changes on the macro fiscal front a lot less noticeable, a lot less perceived as positive. And that actually may have hurt, in some ways. So having a more constructive dialogue is always a positive. Right?
Me or I can, okay.
Open,
So,
yeah.
so I think it's positive, and I think Lula represents in that sense diplomatically a better Brazil. First, because he likes to do this job, he likes to represent Brazil abroad, and the proof is that now he's in Egypt talking to the international community as the president, even though he didn't start. And Bolsonaro is crying, and that's the difference. Okay? The second is that Bolsonaro chose to be an international pariah when he picked a foreign minister that defended, that was against what they call the globalism, and then all the kind of things that we heard. So it damaged the Brazil image in the international community. And even though we can discuss it, this is a fact, the image of Brazil was affected by the Bolsonaro government. So I think the Lula coming to the international stage is good. Also because the main topic by now is climate change, and Bolsonaro and Lula means like Brazil is back in the discussion of climate change as part of the solution, no more part of the problem. So also like that, and all of that, and also I think, and I'm not an economist, and probably you know better than me, so that's very risky to me to give an opinion. But
I give opinions about political stuff.
Internationally, we are now seeing a war in Russia and Ukraine, and we are seeing China changing a lot, and a lot of the money of the emerging markets that usually goes to Russia or goes to other parts. They don't. Those investors don't have plenty of options, and they will need to focus somehow in Latin America. And when you go to Latin America, you have some options. You could go to Argentina, you could go to Chile, you could go to Colombia, you could go to Mexico, you could go to Brazil. And I think that if you compare, Brazil is in a better place than, maybe not Mexico, but better than Argentina, better than Colombia, better than Venezuela, and so on. So I think internationally too, in terms of international investments, Brazil is in a better place. So if you compare, Brazil is also in a good one.
Professor Fischl, do you think that Lula, as a president, he would be able to leverage his reputation?
You have to remember that Lula had a foreign minister, Amorim, who was and who will come back in terms of wanting the power that was associated with being not only foreign minister for a while and then becoming defense minister and other decisions. So that is going to be a problem. The money that will come for the Amazon region will not be as substantial as he thinks it will be. The number of countries that are facing needs for their own resources in order to deal with this problem are quite substantial. So I don't think that dream of getting the rest of the world to finance the Amazon is really possible. I think, again, that Lula has to focus on the private sector and has to have the private sector being important and being there in terms of innovation and technology and being able, exactly as the Chinese were able to do. How did the Chinese become so successful so quickly? Because of technology. And this whole problem of the failure to exploit technology seems to me a necessity.
Professor, that sounds like music to my ears, as someone who works in that sector. So we are finishing the first part of our discussion here, and we're gonna stop the transmission so that we can continue with an open conversation And just reminding everyone again, we're operating under Chatham House rules, which means that we're keeping conversation private. At the same time, that gives us the opportunity to discuss maybe some more controversial issues. And